Welcome back. Today on our journey through the Bible, we will learn about a man after God's own heart.
I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so.
Genesis of Judah's dynasty. Our memory verse today comes from Hebrews 11, verse 6. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Unlikely king. Shortly after the rejection of Saul, God spoke to Samuel and told him it was time to stop mourning for Saul. Now it was time for Samuel to anoint the better man God had chosen to be king of Israel. God sent Samuel to Bethlehem, Judah, to the house of Jesse, the son of Obed, to anoint the new king. Samuel was nervous that Saul would kill him for doing this. So God told him to go to Jesse's house to offer sacrifice with him and his sons. Jesse called 7 of his 8 sons, and they prepared themselves for the service with the prophet. When Samuel began examining Jesse's sons, he thought Eliab, the eldest, was definitely the Lord's chosen. He was tall and good-looking, but God told him not to look on his outward appearance, because his heart was not right. Then Jesse called his other sons, Abinadab, Shammah, and 4 others. God had not chosen any of them. So Samuel asked Jesse if he had any other sons. Jesse responded that the youngest was out keeping the sheep. Jesse sent and called him home. The youngest was unpolished, but good-looking also. God told Samuel this was the one, anoint him. In the presence of his older brothers and his father, David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. The Spirit of God had left Saul, and an evil spirit tormented him. So his servants advised him to have someone play music to calm his nerves. They told him of a young shepherd boy with whom the Spirit of God was. The son of Jesse, who played the harp very well, was wise, brave, and pleasant to be around. Saul then sent messengers to Jesse requesting his son to come to the palace. As a good citizen, Jesse complied, and David was brought into the palace to play music for the king whenever the evil spirit would torment him. He was also the king's armor-bearer, and was therefore exposed to all the daily activities of governing the kingdom. A boy named David. One day, the Philistine army gathered and set up camp in the land of Judah to challenge Israel. The Israelite army set up camp on the other side of the valley of Elah. The Philistines made a proposal that they would send 1 man and Israel should send 1 man to fight. Whoever's champion lost would be the servants of the victors. The Israelites agreed to this proposal, so the Philistines presented their champion, a giant named Goliath from the city of Gath, who was 9 feet 9 inches tall. When the Israelite army saw him, they and King Saul were afraid. Day after day, Goliath taunted the Israelites, demanding a man to fight, and he mocked and ridiculed the God of Israel. David had returned from the palace to his father's house to care for his sheep. His 3 oldest brothers were in Saul's army. So Jesse sent him to take food to his brothers on the front line. When David arrived at the battlefield, he heard Goliath pronouncing his daily taunts, and he saw the Israelite army cowering in fear. This caused David great consternation. He asked what the man that killed Goliath would get. The men around him told him that the king had promised that the man's father's family would live tax-free, and the man would get the king's daughter as his wife. Eliab heard David's inquiries and became very angry with him, and called him proud and naughty, and told him to go home to his sheep. But David responded, "Is there not a cause?" David's interest in fighting Goliath reached the king's ear. He sent for David and warned him that he was only a youth, and Goliath was a warrior from his youth. David then recounted how God had worked through him to kill a lion and a bear when he kept his sheep. With that, Saul agreed to let David go and fight. He gave David his armor, but after trying it on, David declined to use it. David went down to fight in his normal clothes, holding his shepherd's staff and bag and his sling. David went into the valley and to the river and chose 5 smooth stones, which he placed in his bag. When Goliath saw who was coming to fight him, he became irate. He yelled, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" He promised to feed David to the birds. Then David responded, "Thou comest to me with sword and with spear and with shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies whom thou hast defied." David promised that God would give Goliath and the Philistines into his hands, and that he would take Goliath's head. Goliath approached David, and David ran to meet Goliath. He took 1 stone from his bag and slung it. Before Goliath could react, David's stone sunk into Goliath's head, and he fell to the ground on his face. Then David ran up to Goliath's body, took his sword, and removed his head. When the Israelite army saw this, they charged at the Philistine army, and the Philistine army retreated. The Israelite army overtook and spoiled the Philistines. In the palace. After the defeat of the Philistines, Saul told David not to go home again, but to stay in the palace with him. So David did. David and Jonathan, Saul's son, became best of friends, because they shared an abiding, active faith in God. While in the palace, David was appointed the head of a regime of the Israelite army, and fought many wars for Saul. The people came to love him, and the women sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s." This was very disconcerting to the paranoid, God-forsaken king. From that time, he began to watch David and became afraid of him. One day, when the evil spirit was tormenting Saul, David came to play for him. Saul became so angry, he threw his javelin at David, attempting to kill him. Saul then sent David away to fight more wars in hopes that he would die. But David kept coming back, and the people kept loving him more and more, and Saul became more and more angry. When David came back from war, he would give Saul a wide berth, so as not to cause him anger. When Saul saw this, he became more afraid of David. David had not married Saul's eldest daughter as he was promised, but his younger daughter, Michal, loved David. So Saul gave her to him to be his wife, and hoped she would be a distraction to him. But she only helped him avoid Saul's wrath, and David stayed focused on God's work, fighting the Israelites' battles. The visible presence of God in David's life made the king continually angry with David, to the point that he was enraged with his own son for being David's friend. In all this, David continued to act wisely. Then Saul gave orders that David should be killed. When David heard this, he hid from Saul. After a while had passed, he and Jonathan made arrangements to determine if the king's wrath was abated, so that David could return to the palace. When Jonathan spoke to his father of David's return, Saul hurled a javelin at his own son. This finalized the matter, that David could never return to Saul's palace. Now David was on the lam from Saul. Life on the run. David is now on the run from Saul. Even though he knew in his heart, his entire family knew, and Saul and his entire family suspected that David had been anointed to be the next king of Israel, David had to run. Saul was still reigning and was determined to kill David. David hid among the Philistines. He hid in caves. He kept steadily on the move to avoid Saul and his army. During the time when David was on the run, Samuel the prophet died, and the people of Israel mourned him and buried him near his home. While on the run, David gained followers. All the men of Israel who had grievances with the crown joined David's band, because they saw in him a God-fearing and just leader. At one time, when they were on the move, they were near the property of a man called Nabal. Because David and his men were strong fighters, they provided protection from robbers and thieves that would harm Nabal's shepherds. As a repayment, David requested that Nabal should give his men some food for their service. Nabal churlishly denied David's request, denouncing him as a runaway servant from Saul. This response made David livid, so he and his men prepared themselves to attack and wipe out Nabal and all that was his. However, Nabal's wife, Abigail, was a wise woman. The shepherds went to her and reported what David and his men had done to protect them from robbers, and also let her know what was about to happen to her household. Abigail acted swiftly to gather up food and drink, and she went to David and begged forgiveness for her husband's meanness. David's anger was abated, and he did not kill anyone, but God was still upset with Nabal's behavior towards his chosen king. The next day, Nabal died, and the entire household was preserved because of the wisdom of his wife. Touch not the Lord's anointed. Saul assembled 3,000 men of Israel, pursuing David and his men heavily. One day, Saul followed David into a series of caves. While there, Saul became tired and stopped to rest in one of the caves. David and his men were already in this cave. They hid along the side of the cave while Saul lay down to rest. When Saul was asleep, David's men encouraged him to kill Saul, but David refused. Instead, he cut off the end of Saul's robe, and they left the cave. But even that small act filled David with great guilt. When they were safely away from Saul and his men, David called out to him and showed him what he had done. When Saul realized that David could have killed him, he admitted that David was God's chosen king of Israel. He asked David not to destroy his family's name when he became king. David agreed, and with that he let David go, and Saul returned to the palace. But the devil is a relentless tyrant, and he drove Saul to again hunt David down. This time Saul pursued David into a wilderness. While there, he and his men set up camp and stopped for a rest. David saw them, and so he chose one of his men and went over to Saul's camp. He found Saul alone, sleeping, and again his servant urged him to kill Saul there and then. But David determined that he would not touch the Lord's anointed. because Saul was anointed of God to be king. Instead, David took Saul's spear and his water jar and went away. When safely gone, David called out to Saul and his armor-bearer Abner, inquiring as to why they were pursuing him. He let them know that he could have killed Saul, showing them the spear and water jar. Realizing that David meant him no harm, Saul apologized and David let him go, and he returned to his palace. Now it's time for our activity. What city was David from? That's right, Bethlehem in Judah. He was of the tribe of Judah. Next question. Who taught David the daily workings of being king? That's right, Saul did. While working in the palace, he observed and saw all that Saul had to do. Last question. What was David's job before the king kept him? That's right, he was a shepherd. He kept his father's sheep. Now, write or say the memory verse from memory, and then take a sheet of paper and draw a picture of David killing Goliath.
Yes, Jesus
Next
loves
time,
me.
we'll read about King
Yes,
David's reign.
Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. For